Max Keiser joins us today. He is the host of the Keiser Report and the co-host of the Orange Pill podcast, where he talks all things Bitcoin. We know you love Bitcoin, Max. We can tell by the shirt you're wearing. Welcome back to Kitco. It's good to have you on the show.
Yeah, David Lin, great to be with you.
Now, Max, I have to start by asking you about the infrastructure bill that was recently passed in the Senate. Now, there was regulation in the infrastructure bill that affects cryptocurrency investors because it states that any broker of cryptocurrencies would have to supply information to the IRS. Now, it was unclear who qualifies as a broker, and that's the concern. It was a very vague definition. It could apply potentially to minors as well. And so people who may not have information on their clients would have to supply information to the IRS. That's very confusing, and that could dissuade people from doing business in the U.S. if they can't comply with these new regulations. Recently, an amendment to this language in the bill was blocked. So how do you see this affecting the crypto markets? Should we be worried?
Right. Well, Bitcoin is a global tier one money. We've only had two in history, gold and U.S. Treasury bills. And whatever the U.S. does, it can only hurt the U.S., right? Governments don't ban Bitcoin. Bitcoin bans governments. And if the U.S. wants to take itself out of the Bitcoin game, like Senator Cynthia Lummis was begging and saying, look, we don't want to be left out of the Bitcoin revolution. Please don't be foolish. There's not much anyone can do. I mean, some countries get it, like El Salvador. They're making Bitcoin legal tender. Their GDP is set to triple. Property prices are skyrocketing. There's a great feeling of enthusiasm in the country, and that's gonna follow all over Latin America. Nigeria is going hyper Bitcoinization. Their economy is set to do incredibly well based on a Bitcoin standard. So the U.S. Is in the first world, but if they continue this attitude, they're going to very quickly drop into the second world, if not the third world.
How much of this is due to a lack of education, you think, from the Senate? I was reading a CNN article, and they were talking about how the average age of the Senate is above 60 years old. It's a little bit different than the House. But they were also saying how investors over 50, the majority of investors over 50 in the U.S. have never even heard of cryptocurrencies. What can we do? What, not by we, not just you and me, but what can the cryptocurrency community do to educate people in Congress, in the Senate, and in charge of running the country?
The problem is not that we have a lack of education. The problem is that they're mostly crooks. And what I mean is they've been living off the fiat money hog for decades. This is the 50-year anniversary that the Nixon shock closing the gold window, and we went on a pure fiat money global standard. And the U.S. Senate is one of the chief beneficiaries. They just print a lot of money. They take it for themselves. They're entrenched oligopolists, and they're crooks. So if it takes Bitcoin to clean up the crooked Senate in America, then so be it. They should all be gotten rid of, in my opinion. I think the entire political establishment at this point has proven itself to be worthless.
I'm confused as to why cryptocurrencies were even brought up in the infrastructure bill. What does this have anything to do with the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill?
Well, none of these bills have any coherent sense to them. They're, 2,000 pages? We know that very few senators read these bills. You ask the question, well, will senators ever educate themselves about Bitcoin? How about should senators read the bills that they're signing into law? We know that they don't. We know that people slip things in at the last second to curry favor with their corporate overlords, principally the energy industry or the defense contracting business companies that own them. And they do this in a very crooked manner. It's not government buying for the people. It's a corpocracy buying for the oligarchs.
How's this for theory? Maybe we're not giving them enough credit. Maybe they're really smart. Maybe they're purposely making it more difficult to invest in cryptos in the U.S. so they can make way for their own Fed coin.
I don't give them much credit to think through things beyond that kind of immediate bag of cash that they'll take under the table. So I don't think they put much thought into it other than their own venal, corrupt practices. But as far as Fed coin, that's a different kind of topic, to get into. That's again, that would land on deaf ears. They don't know what that means either. And I don't think that there's a grand strategy behind it. I don't think that you can ascribe any intelligent thought processes whatsoever. These people in the Senate are like goldfish. You can feed them and feed them and feed them, and they're going to eat themselves to death. Right? They're not thinking. They're just jaws. They just eat. That's all they do. They're parasites. They're like tapeworms.
All right, well, so let's talk about central bank digital currencies. That nice segue. It's already happening in other parts of the world. The Chinese central bank is making one. The ECB is considering one. The Bank of England wants to make a Britcoin. The Fed coin is not officially announced, but I'm pretty sure they're thinking about it. How do you see this playing out, and what does that leave? What does that mean for Bitcoin investors? Will people be washed out, or is this a better opportunity, you think?
Central bank digital currencies don't compete with Bitcoin. They're centralized. They're easily hacked. They're put forward by the same people who do the fiat money. It's just a digital version of fiat money. We already have digital money from the central banks already. They're just repeating themselves. It's just more of the same. It doesn't compete with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is decentralized. It's unconfiscatable. It's uncensorable. It's unhackable, if you will. So this is a vastly different situation. It shows that they're desperate and they're trying to catch up to Bitcoin. And the only way they know how to do it is to kind of do the same thing they've been doing for decades, print money and pretend like there's not inflation, pretend like there's not a wealth and income gap, pretend like they're not causing climate change. But from all the money printing that they're doing, they don't want to make that connection. And they own the media. That's why more independent sites and media sites like yourself and others are very important, because you're willing to go against the mainstream media talking points that are fed to them directly from these oligarchs.
You mentioned earlier that the governments can't ban Bitcoin. Well, how about this? Bitcoin may not be a direct competitor to CBDCs and vice versa, but the governments can make it more difficult for you to transact in Bitcoins, right? We've seen that happen in Turkey. Cryptocurrencies are banned as a form of payment. Governments can even ban miners, like in China. So they could put obstacles in the way of working with and transacting in Bitcoin. Do you see that happening?
It's all about game theory. So first of all, if two people want to transact in Bitcoin, any two spots on planet Earth, it's uncensorable. You can't stop it because it's behind an encrypted shield that's impenetrable. So it's never going to be stopped. That's number one. Number two, because as I said before, Bitcoin is the first global reserve currency money that we've seen since gold and treasury bills. And it's global, and we've seen that countries are adopting it, and in so doing, they are transforming their economies outside of the U.S. dollar hegemony, particularly in Latin America, where the dollar is used as a weapon. You know, one of the big mistakes America made was weaponizing the U.S. dollar by sanctioning Iran, by interfering in the SWIFT system, by sanctioning Julian Assange, the money to Julian Assange through the PayPal and the credit cards and all those financial intermediaries. They weaponize themselves. So countries are saying, you know what, we're just going to create our own. We're going to go to Bitcoin, and America can drop dead. We don't care. They're not giving us anything with nothing. They don't ship anything. They don't produce anything. It's all made in China. You know, America's the consumer of last resort. Well, we could get consumers in Africa. We don't need the American consumer. So forget them. Move on. I'd be short the U.S. In a big way. The U.S. Treasury bond is probably, I know Michael Burry is short the U.S. Treasury bonds. I know it's been a widowmaker for 20 years. Everyone who's tried to short the U.S. Treasury bond has been carried out on a stretcher, and it's it's a trade that has not worked for many years. But at some point, it will work, and the U.S. Treasury bond will drop 50%. Yields on those treasuries are going to go to 5, 6, 7%, and the U.S. is going to have to put out the going out of business sign. There's no coming back from that.
Wow. So you think yields will rise? Well, let's save that topic for another time. But going back to the U.S. dollar, every time I ask somebody, a Bitcoin skeptic, for example, that whether or not Bitcoin could eventually dethrone the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, they'll say, well, hey, David, the U.S. dollar has 11 aircraft carriers floating around the world, forcing people to use the dollar. What does Bitcoin have?
Well, first of all, the 11 aircraft carriers, the U.S. military is the biggest consumer of energy in the world. And because of all the money printing, the cost of energy is skyrocketing. And at some point, they won't be able to afford even to fill up the super tankers or their military, because they won't be able to afford the gas. and the gas is over in Saudi Arabia. It's in the Middle East, and it's collapsing, like in Afghanistan, because the U.S., after 20 years of a failed war, is pulling out. So they're losing influence in that region. Saudis are ready to jump ship and do business with China. So they won't even be able to afford their tankers, number one. Number two, with Bitcoin, it's unconfiscatable. It's unlike the US dollar or gold, which is confiscatable. So it doesn't matter if you show up to my house with, a battalion of Marines. You can't get my Bitcoin. It's secured behind an encrypted firewall that's impenetrable. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to try to sweet talk me out of my Bitcoin, offer me something that I want to exchange for. And by the way, if I'm unhappy, I'll simply leave. I'd rather live in El Salvador, where they have seen the light. They're ready to embrace Bitcoin and outsource the monetary policy to Bitcoin. There doesn't need to be a Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of England, a Bank of Japan. Outsource your monetary policy to Bitcoin. Let Bitcoin do for you what you couldn't do for yourself, and that is have a sound money economy.
Why is it better than fiat money and better than gold? Besides, well, I guess it's decentralized and all the other reasons you mentioned. But a lot of politicians would disagree with you. They might say, hey, look, we've got the dollar. Dollar number one, dollar is king. We're going to keep it, and we're not going to let Bitcoin run its course.
But they have no recourse. Look, they can't do anything. That's what's happening in the Senate this week. The senators are bickering, blah, 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 and Bitcoin didn't stop. The next, TikTok, next block. Nothing can stop it. They moved 50% of the mining capacity out of China. It's now in, Texas and Uzbekistan. And the blocks kept coming. The hash rate dropped by 50 or 60%. Now it's on the rise again.
That's right.
It shows you that the network is impenetrable. The network nothing can stop the network. No army, no standing army, no country, no group of countries, the IMF, the World Bank. Nobody can stop Bitcoin blocks from propagating every 10 minutes. That's a fact. And some countries realize it and say, we can build an economy around this outside of the US dollar and be free of the colonial American interests that have been plaguing our region for decades. And they're doing it. Nigeria is saying, hey, you know what? We've got 200 million people in our population. We have problems with our currency. Well, let's just go to a Bitcoin standard and let entrepreneurialism rise. The politicians have nothing to say about this. They're not important in this equation whatsoever. There's no American politician that has anything of any importance to say other than they are now a Bitcoiner, like some of them are. We have a fifth column inside the Senate. We've got at least 3 senators now that are Bitcoiners. And when the midterm elections are happening next year, this is going to be a single vote issue. There's a lot of people will lose their jobs because they don't have a good position on Bitcoin. A lot of new politicians will pick up and get jobs because they are pro-Bitcoin. Remember, all the politicians in the military and all the apparatus of state is run on fiat money, and the value of that fiat money is collapsing. And a lot of those people are going to switch over to Bitcoin. You say politicians don't like it. I'll predict here on this show with 100% certainty that within 4 years, half the politicians in America will be Bitcoiners and working extraordinarily hard to make Bitcoin standard in America.
Perfect segue, Max. I want to show you 2 charts that more or less illustrate the same thing. This is the first one. It's a poll by Gallup. It shows that of U.S. investors, in 2021, only about 6% of people who own $10,000 or more in assets have Bitcoin. This is an improvement from 3 years ago. Only 2% of those investors own Bitcoin. The second chart here is a chart that's been circulating on Twitter. And this shows the Bitcoin adoption rate. On the very right-hand side, in the right-hand corner, is Bitcoin. And you've got a bunch of other technologies that have more or less matured over the years. And it shows how little Bitcoin has gained in the adoption curve relative to other technologies. More or less, both of these charts illustrate that Bitcoin is not yet very far along the adoption curve, and there's a lot of room to climb. It's been around for 11, 12 years now, Max. Why is it that very few people in America have adopted Bitcoin as either an investment or a store of value?
Yeah, you got to look at the global picture. So they've got 200 million users globally, and that number is picking up rapidly. And, I was back working at a .com in Los Angeles during the 90s. And I remember as late as 1996, 1997, you had editorials in the New York Times suggesting that the internet was a fad, it was going to go away, it wouldn't succeed. by Paul Krugman, their Nobel Prize winning chief economic writer. And then suddenly you had that hockey stick moment. You had Netscape went public, and the internet became ubiquitous globally, and it is what it is today. And this is the story of Bitcoin. So we're kind of at that 1997 moment. We're already reached it in a couple of countries outside of the U.S. Again, you can't use the U.S. as the standard bearer. The U.S. is lagging right now. The U.S. is really not the prime country anymore when you're looking about the trends of the next 10 years, unless it does a lot of catching up. America's already in the second world in terms of looking through the situation through Bitcoin. So it may catch up or it may not. I don't see America as indicative of what the trends will be in global finance and Bitcoin in the next 10 years. It's got to play some catch up in here, David Lin. I hope it does. But if it doesn't, the reserve currency changes every 100 years or so. We went before the dollar, it was the British pound. Before that, France had to go, Portugal had to go. And, America had its time. It had a great century. I think it's over. Let's move on to the Bitcoin century.
Who's the leader right now, you think?
In Bitcoin adoption, clearly El Salvador, by making Bitcoin legal tender, is kind of forging a path in Latin America. Now we've got 7 or 8 other countries have now signaled that they're going to go to Bitcoin as legal tender. Nigeria and Africa, as well as Kenya and a few other countries, are now all becoming hyper Bitcoinized. The activity in Africa with Bitcoin is absolutely stunning. And in Europe, it's a little bit more difficult because the ECB and the EU are much more authoritarian and centralized. It's a very top-down autocracy in Europe. So they're having a tougher time than some of these other regions. But it's a bit of an intelligence test. If your leadership in your country are too stupid, you're not going to get it. If you have bright, young, eager, entrepreneurial leadership, you're going to get it. I mean, the U.S., as you mentioned before, that senility that prevails in the U.S. political class is not a feature. It's a bug. I mean, America looks like the old Soviet Union days. And of course, they don't understand Bitcoin. Okay, well, step aside, Pops. Let's let some of these other younger countries take the lead. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
So you're not surprised that some of these developing nations are actually taking the lead in terms of adopting this brand new technology? That doesn't seem odd to you?
No, it makes perfect sense because they've got the most to gain, and they're hungry, and they've got a young population that wants to succeed, and they're entrepreneurial, and they're tired of the colonial games. They're tired of the U.S. dollar hegemony. They're tired of subsidizing. Remember, America's military is not paid for by Americans so much as it's subsidized by foreign countries. It's the foreigners who send us all their cash. They're subsidizing the U.S. military adventurism. And I think that's countries like China and others are saying, you know what, we're tired of this, and we're going to pull the plug. I mean, the situation with China and America is getting quite tense. And China has some interesting cards to play in terms of what they can do on the global currency markets. And I think that's going to be played out pretty soon here. And then that is a net negative for the dollar. And once the dollar really loses a bid, and you have more countries doing what Russia has done, which is to divest themselves completely out of the dollar,
right?
It's going to be really tough to keep this economy going. It's already running on fumes. Inflation is really kicking in, David. I mean, I know you follow what's happening in the inflation front, and it's really starting to hurt. The prices are really, I see that.
Sure.
Like restaurants like Shake Shack, they're on their 4th price rise in less than a year. That's rippling throughout all the various industries. And they can't just keep printing money to give to people to go to Shake Shack, and Shake Shack keep raising money, and then that causes inflation, and then they print more money, and they just can't keep doing that. That's Weimar Republic. That's Venezuela. That's hyperinflation. And that they don't seem to care. And most people who engage in those type of reckless financial policies don't care while they're doing it because they're high on fiat money.
Just before we move on to the crypto markets now, Max, so how far can inflation run?
Unlike the Paul Volcker days, where somebody like Paul Volcker stepped in and started to impose a sane policy of raising rates and and rebalancing the economy and attacking inflation. It's gone so far now that there's nothing they can do except keep feeding the Ponzi scheme. The rates are not going to be raised as a matter of policy to rebalance the economy. They're going to keep printing until the dollar collapses. And I think that day is coming quickly because the inflation, the policy is the opposite of Volcker. So Volcker responded to inflation by raising rates. In this administration, in this Washington D.C., they're responding to inflation by increasing the money printing. They're doing exactly what they're doing in Venezuela. The Venezuelan policy, monetary policy, and the U.S. monetary policy right now are pretty much exactly the same.